All right, hello. So I'm going to try to quickly, I feel like I always take longer than I expect for these videos, but today I'm going to go fast. I'm going to try. So we're going to go over all the questions for essay number two. I'm also going to quickly go over the citations that Professor Solinger mentioned, how they're slightly different. And if at any point you have any questions still, feel free to write them down and bring them in on Tuesday. Or if anything I say is confusing and you want me to clarify it on Tuesday, write that down. Um, so yeah, let's get into it. So here are the questions. You also have this in your assignments tab on Blackboard, but it's nice just to have them all in one place. I'll also, have them on each slide as we go throughout. But like I said, some quick notes. I'll go over citations in a second. First is your rough draft has to be 750 to 1,000 words, which is roughly 3 to 4 double-spaced pages. Your final draft should be 1,000 to 1,250 words. It's about 4 to 5 double-spaced pages. And we are still using MLA documentation or MLA citation. It's just different because we're quoting a different format, right? So we're quoting poems instead of quoting like articles or books. So the last note, professor mentioned this. Basically, anytime you might say author, oh, here the author writes, just say the speaker, and you might say says, because poems are meant to be spoken aloud, so we refer to the writer of the poem as the speaker. So here, this example is from Purdue. I'll also link this citation guide that I'm like quoting from, or I have the examples from, uh, above or below my video on Blackboard, so you can click that and go there if you are confused on how to cite poetry. But it's not too hard. When you cite 2 lines or less, you keep it as 1 line. So it basically reads as like a single quote still, um, and you just use slashes so you can see something there is that doesn't love a wall. That doesn't love a wall? Yeah. Something there is that doesn't love a wall. And then the slash indicates a line break. So in the actual poem, it would be on a separate line. But in this case, we just do that for the sake of like, keeping the essay in a tighter format, I guess. And then at the end, because in this case the quote has already been introduced, or the author or the writer has already been introduced, saying Robert Frost writes, we don't have to say the author's name again. So we don't have to say Frost, 42 through 44. We can just use the page numbers, or sorry, the line numbers. Um, a question I do have for Professor Solinger is I don't know if he would prefer us to use the writer's name, like in this case they say Robert Frost, or if we should just refer to the person as the speaker. It's a question I still have. I don't know. I'm still learning. So, Professor Solinger, let us know your thoughts on that. Then the only difference for any quotes that are longer than 2 lines is that you actually turn it into like a block quote and you give each line a line. So instead of using slashes to indicate a line break, you just basically quote the poem how it's written. So moving on. So going on to the actual questions. So question number 1. The Fish by Bishop, Cart Poem by Hayes, and There Are Birds Here by May all in some way involve an animal in their poems. But why? How does each use an animal? What purpose do they serve in their respective poems? So, in this case, it's straightforward enough to me. We're talking about animals and like what purpose is the animal serving in its poem? What is it doing in the poem that, like, why would the writer of the poem choose to incorporate an animal versus, say, a different natural element? Why not trees? Why not leaves? Why not, dirt? I don't know. So you want to answer that question. How do you go about answering that? In this case, I would start with a broader thesis. So then in my body paragraphs, I would expand on how that poem's animal relates back to that thesis. Sometimes it is nice to have a really specific thesis because then you can have like the topic sentences laid out for you and everything will be like easy to work into. But because there's a lot of moving elements, I would say, in this question, not only do you have to discuss the poem, like each poem itself, but also the animals within the poems, your thesis would be really long if you tried to actually break it down into like to have 3 topic sentences in your thesis. So in this case, I would keep it broader and then just break it down in my body paragraphs. So my mock thesis might be animals in poems are used as a symbol to convey hope, right? So in this case, I'm talking about how they're a symbol and how they convey hope. I'm not going to go over all the quotes. Again, I'm trying to keep this shorter, but I'll go over the last one. There are birds here. The speaker says, there are birds here, so many birds here, is what I was trying to say. So in this case, I have to provide a lot of context, right? I have to talk about how in the poem, the person is writing or the speaker is saying that people think of Detroit as, you know, a very desolate place. There's not a lot of people there. How could anybody be happy here, right? And yet, you know, the speaker is saying there are birds here. There are so many birds here. Like, this place is actually thriving, right? So in a way, the birds are a stand-in for hope, right? So I can't just drop this quote in because it's not going to make any sense to the reader. Or they'd have to do a lot of like mental gymnastics to understand what I'm trying to get at. So I have to provide context before this quote and then also analyze this quote and tie it back into my broader thesis. So moving on to question number 2. Arguably, every poem that we have read this semester is about the struggle to survive, the difficulty or even the seeming impossibility of it. Using any combination of the 6 poems we have read, write an essay about how each deal with this fundamental issue. Excuse me. So the struggle to survive. Again, first step in answering any of these questions is breaking down the question. So struggle to survive can mean a lot of things. It could mean like literal survival. In this case, you know, we read poems about like police brutality, racism, right? So that's like a literal struggle because people are actually dying. There is still a struggle to survive though that is less literal, right? Like identity. It is hard to, you know, to feel like you're basically just surviving, right? And actually, I don't know how to say his last name. Oliveras? God, I don't know. I always want to say Olivia Veras. But he says, right, like he's a survivor, right? And his work is to spread, you know, the discussions or the topics of survivors, right? So he calls himself a survivor. So you can interpret this question different ways, and therefore your answer could be very different. So I gave 3 ideas of 3 different struggles. So you have a struggle of identity. So he says, I try to become American, but America is toxic. I try to become Mexican, but Mexico is toxic, right? So that's his battle of identity, a battle to, you know, survive because he doesn't even know who he is. The idea of self-acceptance is another one, right? In Joy Priest's poem, she says, another little ghost I can't bear to leave behind. So in this case, you know, she's talking about how there's like these little parts of her and she can't bear to like, you know, change really. I talked about this in class, how she's almost scared of change. Even though she has these like past lives that she still brings with her and she knows she's changed before, she still can't accept that she might change in the future. So again, you know, going on this theme of self-acceptance. Then we move into the more like, I would say, literal like definition of survive, which goes into like the racism, police brutality angle, which is, in this case, I quoted Smith saying, I'm sick of writing this poem, but bring the boy, his new name, his same old body, ordinary, black, dead thing. Bring him and we will mourn until we forget what we are mourning. Right? So like, I would say very like pointed in terms of, oh, like that's what we're trying to survive here. Like that is what the struggle of surviving is for this person and this group of people. So there's probably even more ways you could talk about survival, but pick one theme, right? So focus on identity, focus on self-acceptance, focus on police brutality. I'm trying to think of more, but my brain is, you know, searching. Just choose one type of struggle to focus on and find quotes within that. Again, there's no limitation to how many of the poems you want to use. Probably be pretty hard to use all 6, but I would say use at least 2 to 4 probably, and make sure that they all fit to the theme of struggle that you're dealing with in your essay. I mean, also maybe you personally. Maybe you're dealing with one of these struggles personally, and you could include some of your own personal experience, but mostly focus on the poems. Oh yeah. So again, make sure you're not just writing about like what struggle the poets are discussing, right? So here the Smith is discussing how police brutality affects this group of people, right? But write about how the speaker in the poem is dealing with that struggle, right? Are they giving up? Are they fighting even harder? What does the speaker seem to be turning to in order to deal with the struggle that they're facing? Right? So again, you're not just talking about the struggle, but you're talking about how they deal with that struggle. So there's a lot of text here. Don't worry, I'm going to go slow. But this is question number 3. So, How to Forgive by Nguyen, Not an Elegy for Mike Brown by Smith, and Cart Poem by Hayes all deal with social injustice. Using any or all of these poems, write an essay that argues how they use their work to draw attention to these injustices. In what ways do they do differently? I think there's a typo there. I'm just going to say, what things do they do differently than a news story might? So I have all the quotes here. Again, I'm not going to go over every single one, but to me, this is actually the easiest question because the question is essentially, how are these poems different than a news story and how are they effective, right? What are these poems employing that is like attention grabbing or is very like, whoa, I did not expect that. So I'll use the first poem because I think that's a good example. So, it says, I'm a believer too, in the power of food at least, having seen a footbridge of cart packed gill to gill, packed tighter than a room of boy prisoners waiting to talk poetry to a young black poet, packed so close they'd have eaten each other had there been nothing else to eat. So this is the very end of the poem, right? After he's discussed, going into this prison, and you kind of get this like bleak outlook almost. And so you're not really expecting all of a sudden for him to say, oh, all these boys are cramped in there because they're waiting to listen to poetry. Like it kind of flips it on its head, right? And so to me, that is the thing that draws attention in this poem, and that's the thing that makes people question their biases if they're like, oh, he's talking about a black area and he's talking about a prison. Like, of course it's going to be sad. It's going to be bleak in there. And then all of a sudden there's like this sign of hope, and you're like, whoa, that wasn't what I was expecting. I'll also talk about the last one here, How to Forgive, because I wasn't there in class when we went over this poem, but I could see how this poem could like easily kind of be skipped over because I'm not saying it's a bad poem. It's actually a great poem, but it's not necessarily as like easy to understand as some of the other ones. So she says, I don't like this memory because I did nothing. In remembering, I become nothing again. So to me, this is like very, again, pointed, very like attention grabbing because it really conveys just how powerless the speaker felt in that moment within the poem. And we could also, or, in your essay, you could also discuss how the whole poem itself is kind of her recounting multiple memories. And so it might allude to the idea that she still struggles to be, quote unquote, something because of how many of these types of memories she has. So, right, if she like doesn't like a memory and it's because in remembering it she becomes nothing, if she's talking about all these memories that she doesn't like and she's becoming nothing again, like what does that say, right? Like how sort of invisible might she feel? So that's the angle that I might take with this. Again, I personally think that this is the easiest one. You might feel differently. But to me, the question really is just asking, they all deal with social injustice. How do they draw attention to the problem that they're discussing? So yeah. Now we get on to question number 4, which, as we went over on Thursday, is definitely, in my opinion, the hardest question. Also, according to Professor Solinger, the hardest question. Because, I say this one is for the poetry lovers out there. I would say you have to like really be into poetry because you'd have to have enough of like a base understanding of poetry to come up with your own definition of it. Because that's basically what Professor is asking you. So I said, in a way, Professor is being sneaky, and he's almost asking you to write an Ars Poetica poem yourself, but he's kind of doing it in an essay form versus an actual poem. He's being sneaky because he's saying, oh, find your own Ars Poetica poem, right? And he's doing that because then any of the, like, you could basically choose a poem that you might write or a poem that you really identify with, and that would end up being your definition of poetry, right? So this question is really, you have to describe what a poem means to you. So it's asking you to come up with a definition of poetry and a reason for why it exists. So again, like it's hard because I can't answer it for you. You have to, I've, was an art student, so it's similar to what is art? Right? Like I had a discussion board once where I had to answer like how to respond to that question, like what was my definition of art? And I was like, oh shit, I've never thought about that. So it's pretty much the same thing because poetry is art for sure. Art is more broad, I would say, but poetry is still like very complicated in that sense. It's really hard to describe. So I can't give you too much ideas here because it will be different depending on every person. But what I can give you is like my perspective and my take and how I would go about writing an essay for this question. So this would be my thesis. I might say, poetry is for those who can't sing, but still have a voice that needs to be heard. So in in essence, my thesis is also very poetic, right? Which I think is like fitting. And this would be my thesis, and I would expand on it in my body paragraphs. So I would go on to explain that like, and not necessarily so literal, but like for the sake of a PowerPoint, I have to like break it down. So I would say that those who can sing are like people who are fortunate and the people who are given like many opportunities in life, right? And those who still have a voice that needs to be heard, right? So they can't sing, but they still have a voice. These are the people who are not so fortunate, but they use that knowledge of what it's like to struggle to try and help the people who are just like them. So that's my take. um, that's, that's like that's still not necessarily defining what poetry is, but that's like giving a purpose to what poetry is for. Um, which actually, now that I'm reading the question back, it says, what is poetry for? What should it be? You don't necessarily have to define what poetry is. It's not like you have to say, oh, poetry is a composition of multiple lines. Like, you don't have to do that sort of definition. But again, you have to say, why is poetry a thing? What should it be used for? So that's the best I got. So good luck. If you're still confused, again, make sure to write any questions down, bring them in on Tuesday. Again, my ranking of difficulty would be number 3, which is the one dealing with injustices, right? Because again, this question is really like analytical. It's saying, find the places that poets use language to effectively convey their emotions or thoughts. In more simple terms, what parts of the poem are the most dramatic and attention-grabbing for the audience, and why? I think that's a good way of like breaking down that question. Then number 1, which is the animal poem. Animals are a symbol. What are they a symbol for? Is it hope? Is it rage? Is it disgust? It's probably not disgust, but it could be. I don't know. You could try. And number 2, which is the struggle. This one is just a little bit tough because, again, it's more open-ended, so you really have to like pick a theme and stick to it. These questions I always find are a little bit more challenging for students because they start like kind of going multiple directions, and it's like you really want to stay on track with one specific idea. And then number 4, basically, why does poetry matter? And what is it used for? What should it be used for? That's up to you. But yes, with all that, good luck. Start thinking about what question you want to answer, and come with any questions that you have for us on Tuesday, and I will see you then. All right, bye for now.